Greetings class and welcome to Module 1. The purpose of this video is to provide you with an overview of Melnick and Overholt chapters 1 through 3. Now I believe that much of the content across these chapters will be a review for you, but let's go ahead and take a look at some of the key components across the chapters. Now when we look at chapter 1, I believe it's important for you to be able to differentiate between evidence-based practice, research, and quality improvement. At Immersion, we talked about how the majority of your projects would be quality improvement projects. Now, I will push the envelope a little bit further and say that many of your projects will be evidence-based quality improvement projects. Evidence-based quality improvement projects rely primarily on internal evidence as well as external evidence. And so, remember, it is that external evidence that is generated through rigorous research. So consider both internal and external evidence as the driving force as the driving forces behind the development and implementation of your project. I believe when we look at chapter 1, it's also important for you to fully understand that level of evidence plus the quality of evidence equals the strength of evidence. Does that make sense? That the strength of evidence is not determined simply by the level of evidence, because we can have a study whose design is high on the hierarchy of evidence, but there could be some significant flaws in that study. For example, the sample size was too small, or the instrument lacked reliability and validity. Now, these ideas will be discussed in more detail as we move forward this semester and we talk about the critical appraisal. As is often the case, Chapter 1 in the textbook is an overview, so a lot of different concepts are presented at once, and then we will take a look at each of these different concepts presented across Chapter 1 and dive into them in more detail. So again, do not become overwhelmed when reading the information about critical appraisal, because there are a couple of chapters about the critical appraisal that we will talk about in more detail in the upcoming weeks. This is an introduction to many, again, of the important topics that will be covered this semester. Chapter 1 also introduces us to the evidence-based competencies, and again, they are highlighted in Chapter 1 but not discussed in detail until Chapter 11. If you wanted to, you could jump ahead to Chapter 11 and take a look and see where you were with regards to those evidence-based competencies, or you might wait until we look at that chapter later in the term. I do believe it's important you become familiar with box 1.2 on page 19, the steps of evidence-based practice. Now, do recognize that those steps of evidence-based practice might vary somewhat across the textbooks and across the literature. Right now, we are at step 0. At step 1, we are cultivating that spirit of inquiry, and we are in the middle of the development and refinement of our PICO questions. Soon, we will dive into the search and the critical appraisal of the research. Hierarchy of evidence that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, you can reference box 1.3. I believe the hierarchy of evidence in this table will be important and significant to you as you assimilate your literature. But again, this information will be discussed in more detail as we move forward with the search, the collection of external evidence, and the critical appraisal. When we finish chapter 1, I think one of the other important points to highlight is the links for the evidence-based practice centers. So you might look more into the Helen Fold Institute, Johns Hopkins. Those are two of the evidence-based practice centers that I more commonly consult. Again, the Helen Fold and the Johns Hopkins, and there are links provided within your textbook for each of those. Now, when we move into Chapter 2, we will focus a lot on the content across Chapter 2 of this first week. Chapter 2 really introduces us to everything we need to know about the development of your clinical question. I think it's important that you're able to differentiate a foreground question from a background question. Chapter 1 is useful in that it will talk to us about the various components of a PICO question. Uh, Different templates are provided for us. I think with all of this information, it is important to keep in the forefront that the question that you develop must be one that is both searchable and answerable. It also must be a question that has stakeholder buy-in. Remember to just think about your organization, the internal evidence. What evidence within your organization suggests a change needs to be made, and where does that change need to be made? From there, we will dive into the external evidence, all right, and find out what exactly could be done, what is best practice that perhaps may not be being done, and then that is what you will implement. That is your scholarly project. So chapter 2 is really useful in helping us pull out those components that are necessary for a clinical question and having us think again about that internal and external evidence. I know I mentioned that a lot, but it's so important. We want to implement a project that is sustainable, one that has buy-in. We don't want to implement a one and done type of project, if that makes sense. Okay? We have formulated that clinical question. Once we have formulated that quick clinical question, we can move on to chapter 3. So chapter 3 presents to us some really good information on sources of evidence, uh, basic and advanced search strategies, and some of this may be familiar to you. Now, the library staff may also have shared some of this information with you. So I think with chapter 3, I want to remind you, if you're diving into your search right now, it will be important for you to document your search strategy. Now, some of your databases will save your searches. I tend to use the paper and pen method. So if I'm searching CINAHL and I combine these two keywords, I'll simply write those down on my notepad and I'll write down how many articles were yielded from those two keywords being combined. So I'm kind of old school, but some of the databases will save your search strategy for you. You will find yourself going back to chapter 3 as we move forward because we will not have our PICO questions solidified now, and that is fine. But chapter 3 is good information to keep in mind again as we start the process. Recognize that the library services, members of the library service, are available to you, and we can reach out to them if you are having problems finding the external evidence to guide the implementation of your project. If you have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, and I look forward to an exciting discussion this first week. Thanks so much.